The storm had rolled in without mercy, a violent downpour that turned the streets into small rivers and whipped the trees until their branches clawed at the air like frantic hands. Daniel Matthews, a single father in his mid-30s, stood by the window of his modest home, watching the rain hammer against the glass with a frown etched across his face. He had just finished reading his daughter, Lily, her favorite bedtime story and tucked her in under the patchwork quilt her grandmother had sewn, when the sharp, unexpected knock on the front door startled him. At this hour, no one came by, and in such weather, the possibility of trouble tugged at the edges of his mind. He grabbed the flashlight from the shelf, his instincts sharpened by years of raising Lily alone, and opened the door cautiously. What met his eyes was not danger but a woman, drenched from head to toe, her elegant dress plastered against her figure, her designer heels sinking into the mud of his porch. Her dark hair clung to her face, and her lips trembled as she tried to form words through the shivers that racked her body. "Please," she said softly, her voice carrying both desperation and a quiet grace, "my car broke down. I didn't know where else to go. Could I stay until the storm eases?" For a moment, Daniel hesitated, his protective nature warring with compassion, but then he saw her eyes that spoke of exhaustion, fear, and vulnerability. He stepped aside, opening the door wider. "Come in before you catch pneumonia," he said simply. She gave a faint smile of relief and stepped inside, dripping water onto the worn rug. She looked painfully out of place in his small living room, surrounded by mismatched furniture, shelves lined with Lily's storybooks, and toys scattered like confetti across the floor. Yet, instead of complaining, she accepted the towel Daniel offered and murmured her thanks as he handed her a steaming cup of tea. She introduced herself only as Clara, nothing more, and Daniel didn't pry. He was too focused on making sure Lily stayed asleep and his unexpected guest warmed up. The rain roared louder outside, but inside the house there was an odd calmness, as though the storm had ushered Clara into their world for a reason neither of them could yet see. As Clara sat on the couch, sipping her tea and glancing around the room with a mixture of curiosity and nostalgia, Daniel noticed something unusual. She didn't seem like someone accustomed to seeking help, and her polished elegance contrasted sharply with the modest surroundings. But for that night, none of it mattered. She was simply a stranger caught in the storm, and he was the man who opened his door. Yet, as the thunder rolled and the night stretched on, Daniel couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting was only the beginning of something much larger, a turn in his quiet life that even the fiercest storm couldn't wash away. Morning came slowly, as though the storm had wrung the world dry and left behind a calm silence that lingered in the air. The golden rays of the sun stretched across the small town, catching puddles of water that sparkled like tiny mirrors, and inside Daniel's modest home, Clara stirred awake on the worn but surprisingly comfortable couch. She blinked against the soft light streaming through the curtains, momentarily disoriented, until the sound of laughter reached her ears. Rising quietly, she followed the delicious aroma of breakfast into the kitchen, where the sight before her made her pause in the doorway. Daniel, sleeves rolled up and hair still damp from an early shower, stood at the stove flipping pancakes with an ease that spoke of years of practice, while Lily, still in her pajamas, carefully laid forks and napkins on the table with a seriousness that made Clara smile. It was such a simple scene, yet it struck her deeply. She, who lived in a world of boardrooms, deadlines, and luxury, could not remember the last time she had experienced a morning that felt this warm, this real. "You didn't have to go to all this trouble," Clara finally said, her voice gentle but carrying that natural confidence she always held. Daniel glanced over his shoulder, offering a small smile. "You were a guest. Guests get breakfast. Besides, Lily insists I make extra pancakes whenever we have company." Lily giggled and looked at Clara with wide, curious eyes. "Are you a princess? You look like one." Clara laughed, a sound so pure it filled the little kitchen like sunlight, and Daniel found himself watching her more closely than he meant to, noticing the way her eyes softened when she looked at his daughter. Clara tried to call for a tow truck using her phone, but the lines were jammed and the storm had knocked out more connections than she realized. Daniel, without hesitation, offered to drive her into town after breakfast, and she found herself both relieved and oddly grateful to accept. On the drive, Clara sat quietly, gazing out the window as the town revealed itself, small shops, friendly faces waving at Daniel's truck, and neighbors who called his name with familiarity and respect. It was clear he was well loved here, a man who had built a reputation not through wealth but through character. She glanced at him, the way his hand rested easily on the steering wheel, the calm strength in his profile, and she felt something stir in her chest that she quickly brushed aside. He thought of her as just Clara, the woman who knocked on his door in the rain, and she wanted to keep it that way. For once in her life, she didn't want to be Clara Bennett, CEO of Bennett Enterprises, the woman whose name filled financial papers and commanded entire rooms. She wanted to be simply Clara, sitting in a truck beside a man who made pancakes for his daughter and offered a stranger shelter without asking for anything in return. And as the sun climbed higher and the town came to life, Clara realized that the storm had not just left her stranded, it had guided her somewhere she hadn't known she needed to be. Days slipped by like pages in a book, and though the storm had long passed, Clara found herself returning to Daniel's small home with reasons she could barely justify even to herself. At first, it was to thank him again for his kindness, then to bring Lily small gifts like books and puzzles, and soon it became dinners shared at the kitchen table, evenings spent laughing over board games, and quiet conversations by the fireplace once Lily had gone to bed. The rhythm of their lives, so different from her usual world of endless meetings and polished skyscrapers, began to weave itself into her heart with surprising ease. She watched Daniel closely, not as the man who had saved her from a storm, but as a father who carried an entire world on his shoulders with uncomplaining strength. One evening, as rain lightly tapped the windows again, not the fierce storm of their first meeting but a soft, soothing drizzle, Daniel finally opened up about his past. Sitting across from her with a quiet sadness in his eyes, he spoke of his late wife, how cancer had stolen her away too soon, leaving him to raise Lily alone. Clara listened, her chest tightening at the raw honesty in his words, her admiration deepening with every sentence. She had built empires, commanded boardrooms, but she had never faced the kind of battle Daniel fought every day, waking early, working tirelessly, giving his daughter a life full of love despite the struggles he hid behind his steady smile. The more she came to know him, the more Clara's carefully built walls began to crumble. His laughter warmed her, his gentleness disarmed her, and his strength humbled her. Yet even as her heart leaned toward him, Daniel wrestled with his own doubts. He noticed her grace, her refined manners, the way she carried herself with a quiet authority that didn't match the story of just being Clara. He couldn't shake the feeling that she belonged to a world far above his own, a world of elegance and privilege that had nothing to do with his modest home and second-hand truck. Still, he let himself enjoy her presence, even if he told himself it was fleeting. But the truth had a way of finding light. One afternoon, Lily, ever curious and resourceful, had been using her tablet when Clara stepped outside to take a call. Within minutes, the little girl's eyes went wide, and her gasp echoed through the living room. "Daddy," she shouted with the excitement only a child could muster, "Clara's on the internet. She's a boss lady. Like, a really, really big one." Daniel froze, his heart thudding heavily in his chest as Clara walked back inside, her face paling as she realized what had happened. In Lily's innocent discovery, her carefully guarded secret had spilled into the open. She wasn't just Clara, the stranded stranger from a storm. She was Clara Bennett, CEO of Bennett Enterprises, a woman whose name carried weight across the business world. And as the truth hung heavy in the air, Daniel felt his world tilt, torn between the warmth he had come to cherish and the reality of the distance between them. The silence that followed Lily's innocent revelation felt heavier than the thunder from the storm that had first brought Clara to Daniel's door, and for a long moment neither adult spoke, both caught between the truth and the fragile bond that had blossomed in its shadow. Daniel finally broke the quiet, his voice low and uncertain, asking the question that weighed on his heart, "Why didn't you tell me?" Clara set down her phone, her fingers trembling as she looked at him, her eyes shimmering not with pride but with vulnerability. "Because I wanted you to see me," she confessed softly, "not my company, not my wealth, not the name that fills headlines. Just me. For once in my life, I wanted to be Clara, the woman, not the CEO. Daniel looked away, struggling with a wave of insecurity he had fought for years, the fear of not being enough resurfacing with every thought. He glanced around his small home, at the patched-up roof he had saved months to fix, at the hand-me-down furniture, at the life he had built piece by piece for Lily, and he whispered, "You deserve someone who can give you the world, Clara. I can't even give you a vacation without planning for years." Clara stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his, and there was a fire in her voice now, a fierce honesty that left no room for doubt. "Daniel, I don't need the world. I already have it, and it means nothing without someone to share it with. What I need is someone who makes me feel safe, who makes me laugh, who reminds me what it feels like to belong. And you already have." Her words hit him like the sun breaking through storm clouds, melting away the last of the walls he had built around his heart, and before he could think of reasons to resist, his arms moved on their own, pulling her into an embrace that felt both terrifying and inevitable. Clara melted against him, relief flooding her as though she had been holding her breath for years and finally exhaled, and when she lifted her face, Daniel kissed her with a tenderness that promised more than words ever could. From the doorway, Lily clapped her hands together in delight, her childish voice ringing with unfiltered joy. "Does this mean Clara's staying?" Both adults laughed through the emotion of the moment, realizing that in the simplest of terms, that was exactly what it meant. For Clara, love had not come from boardrooms or gala dinners but from pancakes in a small kitchen, from laughter shared by a crackling fireplace, from the steady strength of a single father who had given her shelter on a stormy night without knowing he was also giving her a home for her heart. For Daniel, love had not arrived in the form he expected, but in the woman who proved that status and wealth could not outshine kindness and sincerity. And as the three of them stood together in that modest living room, the storm outside long gone, it became clear that sometimes fate doesn't come with a grand announcement, it knocks on your door in the middle of the night, soaking wet, and changes your life forever.